Ready to go. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is some practical tips for getting the best out of a traumatized person. It's sort of got two layers. One is about getting the information that you need to give the legal advice that you want to give, or prepare the documents that you're doing. But it's also about doing it in a way that is least likely to re-traumatize the person. So your physical office setup can have a big impact. You need to make sure that you've got a quiet, calm, and private space. We all, as lawyers, we need confidential spaces, and that seems obvious, but being quiet and calm is also important. Have tissues available. If the person's likely to start crying, it's good to have them right on hand. Visible materials that demonstrate awareness of DV issues can often calm people down and make them trust you and give them some confidence in how you're going to be dealing with them and speaking to them. Posters are a good way to do that, and there are a lot of posters available. Now, consider making small things available for clients to touch, and this sort of seems a bit strange, but stress balls and smooth stones are often a really good way to ground people and bring them back to the moment if they are going through the traumatic event again. There's all sorts of aids around, but just a stress ball is often a good thing to have there. There will often be support people that people will want to bring into the interview, and whether that's family or friends, or whether it's a support worker from a community service such as a DV service. It's important that your service has a protocol for whether those people can attend, in what circumstances they can attend, and most important, that the client that's communicated to the client ahead of time. Now, every service is going to have their own protocols for that, and it's just a matter of having an agreement about that and making sure that the client understands the parameters of support people attending. Support people can be very useful, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them later on. You should ask the client if they want the door closed. I guess as lawyers, we revert to a closed door because it's a confidential space, but a closed door can sometimes really trigger trauma for people. So if possible, if you can leave the door open in a way that still maintains the confidentiality, then it's good to give the client that option. Ask the client where they want to sit. They may want to sit so they can see the door. They may want to sit next to the door. There's often not an option for that, but if there is an option, then give them the choice. Tell them that they can take a break at any time, so that you sort of set the rules at the beginning, so they know that they don't need to just keep going. Okay. It's important that you don't necessarily expect that they're going to tell you a linear story. So a chronological story is often not what you'll get. And in dealing with that, if someone is not able to stick to the story, or that they're struggling with giving you the story, you can give them prompting questions such as, well, what do you remember now? Do you remember any sounds or smells or sensations? And often those sorts of sensory things will be a trigger, but will also be a trigger to recovering that memory. And so that can be a way to give them a reminder of what happened. Grounding questions can be good if they're starting to get distressed. So I guess it's part of taking a break. Do you want a glass of water? Do you want a break? Just to bring them back to the moment, so that that the trauma and the symptoms don't ramp up, but also just to decrease their trauma. Remember that with traumatized clients, usually you need more time, and time is something that most of us don't have. Whether it's private practice, legal aid, community legal centres, we're all, got great demands on our time. But with traumatised clients, they do often need more time, and it's good to recognise that. It may be that you give the client some options for how you can do that time. Some people might be able to sit there for 5 hours if you've got the capacity and talk about it, but sometimes you might need to schedule a number of shorter appointments if it's going to be distressing for them. I'm just going to, sorry. Sorry. There's ways to maximize the time that you have with the client, though. So, we need to make sure that the time we've got is used well. So one way is to find any other documents that are going to tell the story. So any background police statements, applications for protection orders, anything that's available. If they have been engaging with a support service, there may be a risk assessment tool that they've been used. And if the service is willing to share that with you, then it gives you some details. So ask the client whether there's any documents that they have, and they may bring a suitcase full of documents, but that at least you've got something there to refer to. It also means that they're not actually repeating their story over and over. We can also utilise support people. Of course, we do that with the client's written consent where possible. Now, support people can help the client to either write down the story to bring it, but they can also maybe help the client to remember things. And they might also be able to provide you directly with some of the background, particularly if there's someone who's have been to a domestic violence counselling service and they've gone through the story again. And that again is the way to minimise the repeating of the traumatic events for the client. I always find that it's really useful for at the end of an appointment with someone who's experienced trauma to write basically a homework list. So this is what you need to do. This is what I'm going to be doing. And so that sheet can be given to the client, and the support person can help them to complete those tasks. The support people can also be really useful for providing emotional support at court. There are DV services at a lot of domestic violence magistrates' courts list, but if you have a one-on-one support person for that client, then it's going to be a lot more comforting for them, and the court process is going to be a lot less traumatic. Okay. So after the appointment, remember that the client may not retain information well. So that's one of the symptoms of trauma, is that they're not going to remember a lot of what you told, possibly what you've told them. So that's where I spoke about it earlier, that shorter and more frequent appointments can work well, where you can do that so that they're only having to take in small amounts of information. And again, the to-do list for the client that you can provide to a support worker. Expect, that clients are going to come back and want you to repeat the same advice sometimes. And while that can be frustrating, if you view that in the lens of the person who has experienced trauma, then you can understand why they're asking for the advice to be repeated. Okay. Preparing a traumatized client for court. I think that court is one of the hardest things for people to do who've experienced trauma. Now, I would also say that a lot of clients have said that just coming to the lawyer is traumatic, but going to court is just a level up there. If you're going to court for the person, be really clear about a time and place to meet. Write it down so they can take it away. If you can print out a map of where the court is, if you can we'll write down the address so that they've got all that information with them. Maybe you could text it to them so that they've got it on their phone. Suggest that they take a support person and take them through what's likely to happen. So particularly if you're, either magistrates court or federal circuit court for family law clients, they may have to wait for a long time, and people often don't realise that. They think that they're listed for 9:30 and they'll get straight on. They don't realise that they still could be there at 2:30. And another important thing, where clients have got children, just tell them that it could be all day if they can make arrangements for their children to be put into after-school care or be picked up by someone else. It takes that stress away, because I've had many clients, particularly in the domestic violence duty list, where they just don't realise how long it can take, and there's a level of stress that is raised as the clock starts ticking towards 2 o'clock that is just can be can be alleviated by being prepared for what's going to happen. There's some good court website videos that clients can access. So I've got the links up there, one for the magistrates court and one for the family law courts. They show the inside of the courtroom. They're really worth looking at, and it just can familiarise them with, where they're going to be, what it's going to look like, but also where they're going to sit and what's likely to happen. A lot of people have never been in a courtroom before, so going through with them just some basics about turn your phone off when you go, just be respectful to the magistrate or judge, and that can be really useful as well. Okay, I'm now going to talk a little bit about risk assessment and safety planning. The safety planning is something that that lawyers don't do a lot of, and if you've got access to other services or a social worker within your centre, that safety planning is often done by people, social workers and counsellors who are trained to do that. But when you're dealing with traumatised people, it is a good idea to have some idea of what safety planning involves. We need to think from a client's perspective about how our services allow for safe disclosure of domestic violence. And in doing that, we need to assess the risk. We need to prioritise safety in service delivery. So these are sort of the universal safe practices when you're dealing with people who've experienced domestic violence. If you can put a trauma-informed practice framework in place, that will give you a safety sort of net over all the clients. Screening questions when you're talking to clients is important. So people may not identify that they've experienced domestic violence. A lot of people still think that domestic violence is just physical violence, and it isn't until you actually delve down into their story that you'll realise that there is other forms of violence happening, and you'll be able to identify to the client that that is in fact domestic violence. If you're asking, have you experienced domestic violence, and the answer is yes, then know how you're going to proceed with that, particularly keeping in mind that you may need to do some basic safety planning, or at least make an appropriate referral so that they are kept safe. Okay. When we're assessing risk, there's three crucial elements in what we look at. So we know from death review research that women's own fear is an accurate predictor. So meaning that there's evidence for many women who've been murdered that they were highly fearful and believed that he would kill her. So the victim's own assessment of her levels of risk is a really important thing to take into account. And we can ask that question, what risk do you feel that you're at? She has lived with him, potentially for a long time. She knows him and she is the expert in her situation. In doing that, you also have to be aware that repeated exposure to domestic violence may cause people to normalise that fear. So minimising of risk is also a really common thing that you may encounter. And she also may not feel that she can trust her feelings as to fear, because she might have been blamed by the other party for causing the violence, and then often that's internalised and she takes on that blame herself. So keeping that in mind, you then go to your professional judgment, which does mean, a knowledge of the dynamics of domestic violence and trauma. So that has to come into it as well. And then in forming that professional judgment, you can have regard to evidence-based risk indicators, which I'm going to speak a little bit about. So these evidence-based risk indicators are risk factors that are based on sort of decades of research that's been done. There's a lot of literature out there about that, and we often call them red flags. Okay. So these are homicide risk indicators that have come out of research into what factors were in place when people have been killed through domestic violence. This is not exhaustive. There's long lists, and there's different studies that identify the top ones, but these are some really common ones that have come through with most of the studies that have been done. So separation is one of the most dangerous time, is the most dangerous time for intimate partner homicide. The danger period is the weeks and months before and after separation, and the studies show that the risk reduces over time. But there are other things that may sort of reignite the risk, such things as after separation, even months or years after separation. So things like having to go to court for parenting proceedings or divorce may increase the risk again. So you need to be careful that there's no assumption that just because it's years down the track that risk has dissipated. So strangulation is another risk indicator. There's been a lot more research done in the last few years about strangulation. We now have a specific strangulation offence in our criminal code, and it's surprisingly, well, it's not surprising, but it is common in what a lot of our clients tell us, that strangulation is a feature of the physical domestic violence. It's also an extremely dangerous behaviour physically, strangulation. So it may have impacts immediately, so maybe loss of consciousness and loss of blood to the brain, but we also need to keep in mind that it can have longer term effects and even years down the track. There's studies that show that it can increase the risk of strokes and other brain related injuries. So, just as an aside, if somebody has been strangled, you may want to talk to them about going and getting themselves checked out by a doctor. So fear levels is another one, and I spoke about that in the previous slide. So subjective fear levels. Also escalation. So if the domestic violence is escalating both in severity but also in frequency, that's a red flag for a risk of homicide. Stalking behaviour, whether that's physical stalking by following someone or stalking through technology, is a risk factor. Threats to kill or to commit suicide or to burn the house down, that's a really serious risk indicator and probably one of the more obvious ones. Keep in mind that repeated and specific threats increase the risk. And if those threats are being made in front of witnesses, that's an indication that he's got nothing left to lose, and that increases that risk. Sexual assaults is another one. Isolation, so social isolation. That's of the victim, but also of the perpetrator. So if he is isolated and has limited supports, then that is an increased risk factor. If he has access to weapons, that's one. And the use of drugs and alcohol is an increased risk factor. Now, harm to pets is one which is not perhaps obvious, but is certainly reported by a lot of our clients. So threats of harm to pets or actual harm, and that's often something that really is very is something that he knows that will really get to her and will really affect her. So keep that one in mind as well. Okay. So these are the sort of non-lethal risk, and it's important to remember that domestic homicide is rare in comparison to non-lethal domestic violence. So this is a list of risk factors and impacts of domestic violence for women and children. The majority of victims, survivors, are not killed, but the consequences to them can still be significant and enduring. Many of these impacts can occur whether or not separation eventually occurs. So separation is another high-risk time for non-lethal violence, and pregnancy is another high-risk time. So some research states that domestic violence may start or even escalate during pregnancy, and I would have to say that I've certainly seen that in a lot of the client stories that I've heard over the years. And it's interesting with pregnancy that sometimes it's reported that he's jealous that there is another focus for me, and that my time is taken away from him. Um, and there's a whole new other thing about reproductive coercion that there's been a webinar recently about, which is wrapped up in that. So physical injury is another non-lethal risk. Whether there's emotional and psychological injury, which leads to trauma, financial abuse, um, but that also can lead to consequences of health issues and legal costs for people. Um, Homelessness the DV is the leading cause of homelessness for women in Australia, and often women are forced to choose between staying with the violence and homelessness. So that's another a risk that comes out of non-lethal domestic violence. Social isolation is a risk. So it's usually a result of emotional abuse, and it's a common dynamic of domestic violence behaviour where the abuser will erode her support systems and her confidence to access help and friendships. Um, we look at people's cultural backgrounds, their age, and whether they've experienced a disability. So these are the women who may have their own specific barriers and needs in relation to their experience of domestic violence. There's not a one size fits all for when you're dealing with domestic violence, and you have to keep in mind those cultural backgrounds, age, and in issues when you're looking at whether the level of risk that people are experiencing. Okay, so that's the risks that you're kind of looking at when you're making your professional judgment. And then once you've made your assessment, I guess you go on to some safety planning. And like I said, as lawyers, we're not going to sit down and do an in-depth safety plan, but we can keep in mind what will be done, and we can do some basic safety planning. So firstly, what is she already doing to increase her safety? And that is often can be quite significant. So people will be doing things to increase their safety. She'll understand what resources she can access. Um, but then you need to look at what does she need to do to increase her safety. So extra things that need to be done. It's really important that women are involved in the decision making about how she will increase her safety. She's more likely to follow through with a plan that she's got ownership of. And part of trauma-informed practice is to facilitate her control of the situation. Okay. So safety planning isn't a checklist. Every situation will be different, and also need to keep in mind that situations will change. It's really important that there's an element of education and a raising of awareness that will inform her choices in how she keeps herself safe. There are also challenges when you're safety planning because there's unknown factors out there, and there are risks involved in safety strategies. Sometimes we don't know how the perpetrator will react and how effective the safety strategy will be. So it's important again for the client to have input and to speak of her own experiences and level of fear when that's being done. There's some practical things that can be put in place quite aside from getting a protection order and getting police involved. So limit the opportunities for the abuse to be perpetrated and to continue. And also look at alternatives. So again, looking back to the risks involved, she might block his phone number, which may then actually lead to him coming to the house and increasing her risk. So that all has to be part of the safety planning. You need to look at whether there are risks involved in the legal options. So a DVO may assist, but you need to keep in mind whether the perpetrator is likely to abide by the DVO, and if not, maybe that does increase the risk. So those are all things that you need to take into account. Okay. just on that last slide, it's most important that we refer clients to domestic violence specialist services when you think that they need safety planning, and it needs to be domestic violence specialists. Right, so safety planning in the office for us as lawyers. Consider whether the client would prefer a face-to-face or a telephone consultation. Often they will find that a telephone consultation is easier, especially if they're still living under the one roof. Again, maybe it's safer to come face-to-face if they say they're going out to do the shopping, but give the client the choice. It's really important to find out what are the safe methods of contact where there's domestic violence, because he may have access to her phone or her emails. So ask those questions. Is it safe to phone you? Is it safe to send emails? What about leaving messages on your phone? What about sending text to you? On each intake or file, flag really prominently all of those issues, what are the safe methods of communication, and that needs to be clearly marked for everyone who's maybe dealing with that client, including admin staff who might not be familiar with the client's matter, and admin staff should be trained to be looking for that as a first port of call where they're looking to communicate with the client. Have a protocol for safely exiting a phone call. If somebody else either answers the client's phone, if she doesn't answer the phone, so you can perhaps pretend that it's a wrong number. Also maybe check in with the client if she does answer the phone at the beginning to say that, look, if he does come in, and this is particularly relevant if they're still living under the one roof or not yet separated, if he does come in and you hang up, when do you want us to follow up, and how do you want to deal with that? Also be really aware of tech safety. So confidential information can be disclosed through phone or computer or home bugging, and that's a whole other webinar really. I've just put a few resources there that you can refer to. The WestNet one is really good. Both of those resources are really useful, and it would be worth having a look at those and referring clients to those as well if there's any inkling that the perpetrator is perhaps really tech savvy, and that's a likely, that's something that might be happening. Okay. So safety planning and court applications. With domestic violence orders, timing is really crucial. So you need to be aware of when they were likely to be in court. So find out from the particular registry that you're going to, what is the time between the filing and the serving and the listing, because it can be extremely dangerous if your application is filed and it's likely that he will be served with that before it actually gets listed and you can ask for a temporary order. You can consider requesting an urgent ex parte court date for the temporary protection order, and you can also ask the registry to note that the respondent not be served after the first date, but that is at the discretion of the court. So, and it really does vary. The time between filing and first returns for first mentions for DVOs can really vary from registry to registry. So make sure that you know or you've inquired at the particular registry. Of course, you need to make sure that confidential addresses aren't divulged, and there is a form that can be used, an aggrieved details form, which provides contact details for the court for the aggrieved person, but will not actually be disclosed to the respondent. Also carefully think about the conditions that you're seeking. Are they protective enough? Are they going to cover her safety? Do you need an ouster order? Make sure that they're all listed on the application, keeping in mind that if they're not on the application and the client wants to ask for more protective conditions, the magistrate may not allow that if it's not on the application, and there'll have to be a variation application. So be really thorough about talking to the client about what protection do you think you need, and then tailoring the application to take that into account. Of course, we can tell clients that when there's no guarantee that you will get those, but at least they're on the application. Okay. So Federal Circuit Court applications for parenting and property matters. Remember that court applications may be a trigger, be a trigger for increased risk of further violence, and you need to be taking that into account with safety planning as well. A further referral might need to be made so that the safety plan can be upgraded or changed. Of course, like I said before, safety plans are not a static thing, and they need to be reassessed. So also remember that each time new material within a court case is filed, this may also trigger the violence, particularly affidavit material. Clients need to, this may seem obvious, but when you're preparing, say, affidavit material, just keep reminding the client that he will see this, and she may choose, it may change the way that she wants to do the affidavit to keep her safe. And again, every time new material is filed, refer them for further safety planning if the client or you think that that's necessary. So if the client's address is confidential, double check that the address isn't disclosed on the application itself, obviously. So, at CLCs, we generally will not be on the record for clients. So notice of address, an address for service needs to be a safe address. It might be care of a friend. It might be a PO box. But also double check that any annexure material that any annexure documents that you've annexed to the affidavit don't divulge that confidential address. So you might annex letters from doctors or schools that are addressed to the client. So make sure that you black out in black pen, photocopy it, and then black it out again just to make sure that you can't see through that, because there have been cases where even though it's been blacked out, you can still see it on subsequent copies. So just keep that in mind. But also even just, say, doctor's letters may show the address of the doctor's surgery themselves. And if the client doesn't want to be located at all, it can be a clue. So that might need to be blacked out as well. And the same thing applies to affidavits for domestic violence proceedings if the matter is going to hearing. Okay. So safety at court is really important. Most magistrates' court will provide safe rooms for women where they can wait for domestic violence matters, and hopefully in a lot of courts, they can actually access the courtroom straight from the safe room. So call ahead with the particular court, see if that's an option. There may be security officers specifically for the DV court, and sometimes if they have the capacity, they might be able to help the client to their cars after court. It's good to be aware after a appearance where the perpetrator is, where they're likely to be, and make sure that the client's comfortable in getting to her car or train station or wherever she needs to be. There are DV, domestic violence support service, at most magistrates' court, and they can help with safety planning either on the day or ahead of time. So if you feel that the client has particular risks involved in going to court, you can call them ahead of time. The other way that they can help is they'll be really clued up with how the security works in each particular court. They may be able to arrange for the client to get there early, and they can give you guidance about how to keep the client safe on the day. And family law courts with notice, and it's usually with notice, safety plans can be implemented. I would say that our clients' experiences have been really positive with that, where that's been done. Again, there's security guards at those courts, and they may be able to assist with getting clients safely back to where they need to be after court appearances. Okay. So these are just some safety planning resources that you might want to look at. 1-800-RESPECT has got some good information, some government resources about digital safety, and there's that WestNet resource as well. I'll just leave those with you to have a look at your leisure. So the next one is, just want to talk a little bit about vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma is how we as workers who are dealing with people who have experienced trauma, how that affects us. And it can have some really serious effects, and it's something that we need to keep in mind individually as workers, but there's also a responsibility on all organisations to have a look at how their core business impacts on the workers and whether that exposes them to vicarious trauma. So with CLCs, we need to all staff at management level need to be aware of this, as and they need to be communicating to staff the risks of accumulated trauma on staff. So vicarious trauma is the repeated exposure to clients' traumatic stories. It may also be really in-depth exposure to one client's traumatic story. It's really common in the domestic violence and sexual assault professions, and we need to remember that the effects are cumulative. So it can just turn up one day. The symptoms may just turn up one day with a fairly maybe even benign case that you've heard of, but something triggers it, and then you've gone from being okay to actually experiencing vicarious trauma. That also means that you might not recognise that it's happening until it actually does happen. So what I want to talk about just really briefly is about how you can keep in mind that it could be happening and what you can do to alleviate it. Okay. So the impacts, there's a range of impacts, and it can present really differently in different individuals. So these are just some common impacts, and you'll notice that very obviously that they do mirror the impacts of primary trauma as well. So emotional impacts might be numbness and mood swings, a loss of professional confidence, a loss of self-esteem in the workplace. There may also be cognitive changes, so changes in your self-identity, how you're contributing to your workplace, your clients, changes in your worldview, so beliefs about spirituality and human nature, and that I guess there's cynicism, but when that really does start to change and change your whole worldview and really affect you, then we're looking at vicarious trauma. We may have different perceptions of our own safety after dealing with people who've experienced trauma, and there may be intrusive thoughts, so not be able to switch off the thoughts about your clients. It may cause sleep disturbance, so having nightmares or dreams about traumatic stories that you've heard is a really common thing. It may also affect your appetite, less appetite, more appetite, so stress eating or not eating at all. And it may cause stress symptoms such as headaches, so physical symptoms. It may go over to your behaviour and social life, so your work-life boundaries. Some people might withdraw completely at home or at work. They may become withdrawn at home and working more, or it is another common symptom that people just withdraw at work completely and are unable to function. Maybe an increase in alcohol use, and it might cause strains in personal relationships. Okay. So trauma-informed practice is a way that we can also help to alleviate vicarious trauma for staff. So there's some fill-in parts. So with trauma awareness, if we could go to the slide, thank you. Trauma awareness is understanding vicarious trauma and its impacts. We also need to prioritise safety for clients. So look at building security. For staff, if staff are secure that that all of the perpetrators that you've been dealing with in court can't get into the building. If they were to come, then that can lead to a sense of security, which is going to help. So safety procedures for outreach, where people are seeing clients out in the community, whether it's at other services or at court, it's important that you make those visits in pairs, that you have a mobile phone available when that's being done. And it's also important that there are external supports available So there's the employee assistance program that people can access, but it's also worth thinking about where people who are working regularly with traumatic clients who've been traumatized, they may need to access external supervision. So external supervision is about accessing a psychologist or social worker or a counsellor to actually go through to debrief and to be able to work through the vicarious, well, the stories to avoid vicarious trauma actually happening. And it can be really, really effective in doing that. I know that a lot of us will debrief with our colleagues, and that's often a really important part of collegiality within organisations that are working with traumatised people. But we have to be really careful that you're not traumatising your colleagues by oversharing, I guess, and that's where an external supervisor or the EAP program can actually help with an external debriefing sort of process. So with the organisation needs to commit to staff wellbeing, and we also have to be able to trust our colleagues and the management. So clear communication between staff and management, putting in supervisory structures internally that make sure that there's check-ins regularly about how people are travelling, and making sure that that's done in a confidential way so that there is actually trust within the organisation when people are sharing concerns they might have about how they're reacting on a personal and professional level when they're dealing with trauma. So it's good to offer staff development in this area. There's a lot of training out there that you can access about vicarious trauma and wellbeing within the law. The Law Society, Queensland Law Society, has started to do that. So don't discount those sorts of issues as part of our own professional development. It can also, the translating direct service delivery to law reform is a way that we can work in the system to feel as though there's a difference being made. So I guess what I'm saying with that is that if you are seeing over and over and over and giving advice to traumatized people, it can feel hopeless, and that is one of the symptoms of vicarious trauma. If staff are given the opportunity to actually do maybe community education or law reform activities, that means they can step aside from that direct client contact, it can actually give a bigger meaning to the reason why we are seeing and helping people over and over and over. So it's something that managers it's a good thing for managers to keep in mind. People need a break from just hearing those stories over and over, and if we can go out there into the community and talk about how we can change things so that perhaps we're not seeing as many of those clients, which is the ultimate goal, then it can give a bit more meaning and can give a break from the repeated exposure to the trauma. And collaboration, it's good when staff are involved in strategic planning, and it's good to have consultative structures in place so that people feel as though they're actually participating in a meaningful way in the organisation. Okay. Okay, next one. So how do we prevent vicarious trauma? Well, it's really important to have a supportive work context and there to be formal support mechanisms, like I spoke about, internal supervisory structure that is ensuring that people are being not checked up on, but are being able to check in, and there's a safe place for them to speak about any issues they might be having, and also external supervision, but also informal support. So a workplace culture that is collegial and keeps people happy, I guess. And we also need to take individual responsibility. So keep in mind, are you experiencing signs of vicarious trauma? And if so, are there self-care strategies that you need to be put in place? Do I need to access an EAP or an external supervisor? Even if you're accessing resources about vicarious trauma and doing some self referral for help is a good thing. So self-care strategies will really change from person to person, and it might be just going to the beach or going for a walk. But on the next slide, so if we go to the next slide, there's some resources there for prevention of vicarious trauma, and they're really worthwhile looking at. So I would emphasize and encourage everyone who are working with people who've experienced domestic violence or trauma generally to keep this in mind and to keep it as a priority in our practice, because it can have really long-lasting impacts on workers, and we all want to stay strong and continue to work in this area if we can. Okay, that's the end. Thank you very much for listening to the webinar.
Thanks, Rachel. That was really fantastic and very thorough. So everyone, please do check out those resources for yourselves. And thanks again for listening in and for donating your time, Rachel, to helping upskill some of our people out there. Thanks so much.